Yes.
Okay, so we titled our project Culture Represented Through Artwork. And we decided to study the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection of Pacific and Oceanic artwork. They have about 1,300 pieces of artwork, so it's a pretty vast collection, so we thought we could get a lot of great information from it. And we decided to study art because we thought that it gives insight into a region's culture, religion, local customs, materials, lifestyle, etc. And it allows people to express how they view the world and also how they view themselves, which is a really important part, I think, of anthropology. I put these three statues because when I first looked at them, I would have guessed that they're from the same regions of Oceania. They're all made of wood, they kind of look the same, but if you look closer, like even their facial structures are portrayed very differently. And one of the questions we wanted to answer in our project was, what are the actual differences between these statues? Are they used for different things? Do they have different meanings? So our goal, we wanted to use the artwork to gain a deeper understanding of Melanesian, Polynesia, and Micronesian culture and history. The questions that we asked ourselves before starting were, what were the different materials that they used, what can we infer about their culture based off of their art, and did the West influence artwork and subsequently the culture of these areas?
So we'll start with history of each region and then show you some of the artwork from each region. So starting with Melanesia, some of the earliest art forms are actually found in caves in the 1600s, and they were found by early explorers, but also later, like in the 18th and 19th century. So it's kind of cool that they were able to have some sort of foresight to keep these pieces of artwork in caves where they knew they'd be safe for hundreds of years. And those were some turtle shell masks and also wooden statues, because wooden statues were very prominent in Melanesia as one of the main art forms. So later into the 1800s, there was a lot of cultural disruption, which is what the website referred to a lot as European colonial powers came in, there were missionaries, the people in the islands were being used as workforces, or labor for the colonial powers. So during that time, the wood sculpting declined a lot because with these influences from outsiders, a lot of people were more focused on dealing with the intruders than producing art forms. And then, yeah, although later in the 1800s, I guess maybe perhaps as a form of pacification, some of the wood sculptures came back to life because Westerners brought special tools that were a bit more usable than previously primitive forms of carving wood, such as steel tools. And then into the 20th century, there were still a lot of cultural disruptions. Still, colonial powers were settling in the area and had a lot of influence, but also World War II was a huge disruption because Japanese and Allied forces were occupying the islands. And the colonial powers outlawed intergroup warfare, which is either warfare between natives on each island or among islands. And so that led to a huge decline in wood sculptures, or even just disappearance in some areas, because a lot of the Melanesian people used warfare as a huge symbol to show in their artwork. So when that was outlawed, they didn't really have anything to show in their artwork. Then also with the missionaries' conversion to Christianity, a lot of the sculptures were also very religious. So, of course, the missionaries wanted to destroy them and get them out of the way as soon as possible. But luckily, in the last part of the 20th century, there was kind of a renaissance of sorts by a new generation of Melanesian artists that weren't as affected by the different cultural disruptions that we saw earlier. So there was a lot of, like, a large return to traditional art and performing and visual arts, and also one of the first museums or like cultural exhibitions was opened in New Caledonia, I think. Yeah, that was the first of its kind to showcase indigenous art.
So some basic facts about Melanesian artwork. A lot of the artwork was used in cultural practices, rituals like funerals, religious ceremonies, and practical. There were a few art pieces that were for practical usage, but not as much as Polynesian and Micronesian. I also put surreal to real because a lot of the earlier pieces of artwork were very surreal images of the human form, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then additional materials were introduced by Westerners, but some of the original materials that they used would have been wood, lime, fiber, shell, turtle shells, pigment, nut paste, hair, leaves, lizard skin, pig's tusks, so like anything that they could find in their natural resources. And then Westerners actually introduced some metal and some quills and bamboo, which was like an invasive species plant that they brought on the ships. So artwork of Melanesia, on your left, there's a male figure, it's called an aruba, and every male would have had these, and they're supposed to be hunting helpers, so you leave them in your ceremonial house, and it was supposed to give you good luck when you went out to hunt pigs or whatever you were looking for. And when the men died, their aruba would be stored in caves, like Karina said, and because they were stored in caves, they were preserved for thousands of years, and so that's why we still have them. And if you look at it, that's a very surreal image of the human form, because it's supposed to represent the spirit of the human, the spirit of the hunter. Next to it, you have a mask. It's made from turtle shell. The face of the mask is supposed to be a hero, and it was worn by the senior men because they were looked up to in the culture, very wise. And on the top, there's kind of a bird beak and feathers and wings, and that imagery likens the hero to a bird. And that was used in funeral rites and increase rites, and increase rites were ceremonies that wanted that they prayed for good harvests and an abundance of fish and game. And then to its right, you have the ceremonial board, the malu, and it was very sacred to the people because it was made if a boy died during the initiation process, and we talked a lot about the initiation ceremonies, and it would be revealed to the public it would be revealed to the public once the initiates came in, and it would be the first time that the woman in the village would see if a boy had died during the process. So it's a very sacred object. And it has a lot of natural imagery on it, on the bottom, I don't know if you can really see it, but there's a pig's head because a pig was very sacred to the people of Papua New Guinea. And then up on the right, you have a mask, and that would have been worn by the chiefs. And actually, you can't see out the eyes of it, you can only see out the mouth of it, and that's because it created a taller image and made the chief more intimidating, and it has a toothy and aggressive grin because aggression and intimidation were virtues that were wanted in a chief, and it would be worn during important chief rituals. And then I included the one on the left because we kind of talked about the beetle net, and apparently that has a dual function where it can be an instrument and it can also help you consume beetle net. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then up in the middle you have a breastplate, and this has a lot of natural imagery on it. So the white shell is supposed to represent the moon, and the turtle shell overlay, the V at the bottom is the tail of a bird, and the M's are the wings of that bird, and then it's surrounded, the outside is supposed to represent a dolphin or a shark, they're not really sure what. But I also included this because the rope would have been imported from the West, so you start to see materials being used from the West. And over here you have a ritual board, and the paint would have also been imported from the West, and you start to see Western materials being used on really important sacred objects. Like this ritual board is unique to different tribes, and I think was used during, they called it the pig ceremonies or something, and that'd be where 2,000 people, spectators would come to watch hundreds of dancers. So it was a really important event, and Western paint was starting to be used.
Okay, so now we'll shift gears and start talking about Polynesia. So there's a couple of different factors to consider when talking about Polynesian artwork. For one, Polynesia is made up of over 1,000 islands, and each island has a different culture. So it's hard to consider all Polynesian artwork as one, because they're all kind of different in their own way. But that being said, all of the themes are very similar. They all have to do with religious idols and hierarchies and things like that. And also the materials that are used for the artwork are similar in that they're wood, bone, stone. One iconic piece of Polynesian art that you've all probably seen at the Easter Island big stone statues. So you can just sort of when we're looking at these. Also, Polynesian artwork sort of goes through the same cycle as the other areas did with colonialization. So when missionaries came in, they started destroying the religious idols, which sort of stops the artwork program. And then as the secular artwork persisted, they hold on. Okay, so they started, it consisted mostly of like mats and cloths and things like that. So then they sort of developed a new innovation over the years. Instead of keeping the art for religious purposes, they started selling it, having to do with the commercialization of the islands. And then in the early 20th century, they started making a surge back to the tradition as more islands sort of gained independence and realized that they're losing their culture. They tried to bring it back.
So we'll show a couple examples in a second, but most of the function of Polynesian artwork, as he said, was as a way of showing religious connection to these idols that were, they were either used in rituals or as just, like some people have in our religions today, as just idols in their homes for protection, communication with gods and the spirits. And then they were also used to show your status in society. A lot of chiefs had special pieces that they either wore, like the necklaces we saw earlier, or just as gifts or special commodities that normal people would not be able to have. And then finally, there were a lot of naturalistic representations, because a lot of the other statues you saw were kind of like abstract or surreal, but I'll show an example in a second. There were some representations of ancestors, which were really important in society, and deities and other gods that were more made of natural materials. So on the left is something called handle for a fly whisk. And what a fly whisk is just basically like a fly swatter to keep flies away. As you can see, this is a lot more elaborate than the types we have now. There would have been some sort of feathers or fibers on it for the actual swatting. And this was made out of whale ivory and belonged to someone in the Tahitian royal family. So again, this type of thing is a symbol of high rank and status, because a normal islander would just use their hands to swat flies. Wouldn't be able to have this type of elaborate carved, ornamented item. And then on the right is one of the representations of a god. These were also like representations of ancestors, but this particular example isn't for a god. And this was made out of coconut husk and some other type of fiber. And it also, in that little knob that you see at the top, it also would have had feathers coming off the top. I think the feathers just weren't preserved well. But that was thought to have like the mana power that we talked about of the deities. And so a lot of people would pray to those or worship those in times of distress when they needed some sort of reminder that the gods were supposed to be helping them. And then one more example. This is, again, an example of the return to traditional art, which we read a lot about, the bark cloth. This was actually from the early 20th century, which, as you remember, we read a lot that this was, a large part of the culture tradition, making these bark cloths. And these were sold, but also returned in the 20th century to be used for personal use in the more like ceremonial religious things that we've talked about for funerals or any type of initiation ceremonies and things like that.
Okay, so the history of Micronesia again kind of goes to that same cycle of colonization and having their art forms being decimated by Westerners. Micronesia is a little different because they were explored a little bit later, more in the 1800s, so they didn't have the same decimation as much. They kind of flourished through the 19th century, but once like trader outposts were established and then the Micronesian islands were brought under European control, this increased Western influence and brought Christianity and missionaries to the islands. And the Westerners heavily impacted the lives of the Micronesians, including decimating, taking their lands and then decimating their population. But their artwork continued to flourish, like I said. In Micronesian culture, their artwork is a little more practical, so they have kind of like gender-specific art. Men retain traditional roles as carvers, making bowls, canoe ornaments, ceremonial vessels, and women create textiles, including bands, mats, and bracelets. They also continue with like architectural traditions, and they create like beautiful painted and carved buildings. Also, like just like when they said with Polynesia and Melanesia, they had kind of a revival in the 20th century after like the wars and things like that, because Europeans and people in the States began to appreciate Micronesian art forms as actual art putting in museums instead of just like sources of like information for anthropologists. So, yeah.
So the artwork of Micronesia, despite being a relatively small area, especially compared to some of the other areas in Oceania, it lacks a consistent aesthetic. Many art pieces focus more on the actual physical form, and others focus more on the surface textures and the way it looks. And since the islands are small and much is done, fishing and traveling is done by ocean, a lot of it is influenced by the ocean and used practically in that area. And a lot of the artwork actually has more practical use than simple aesthetic pleasure, and others symbolize cultural mythology and have spiritual importance. So these are examples of artworks that have more practical use. The bracelet, for example, they also made things such as bags. The wooden sea chart was used by navigators. It shows not only the location of islands, but also would show the swells and features of the sea and currents to be used for safe travel. And they were used primarily either as a personal reminder or as an instructive tool towards new navigators. But it was never taken to sea because your ability as a navigator would be called into question. And the total of the woman's valuable was referred to as money. It was handcrafted turtle shell things given to women either on a significant event such as a marriage or the birth of their child, or as sort of a payment for helping with feasts prepared and helping with festivals and things of that nature. So these two are more examples of culturally significant pieces in terms of mythology. The weather charm, for example, would be kept in a box and be taken to sea. And when the weather got dangerous, it would be taken out and they would invoke the beneficial water spirits through chanting until the storm had abated. And then when they got back to an island, it was placed back in its home. The gable figure, which was, this one is specific to the island of Palau. They had men's clubhouses called bai, and they put this above the doorway. And the cultural significance is varied, depending on the reports, but the most common one is that it calls back to a cautionary tale that women should remain chaste.
So in conclusion, as you can see, there were a lot of similarities among the regions, but also some pretty big differences. For example, in Melanesia, mostly things were wooden sculptures representing religious figures. Polynesia had a lot more elaborate materials, especially for the chiefs, like ivory, and there was even some pieces that used shark. And then in Micronesia, again, there were also religious idols, but a lot of it was more for practical purposes. And again, you can see in all three regions the influence that Western powers or just even events that were in the West affected the change in art forms or the change in what these pieces were used for, even how they looked. But then there was always, luckily, a revival or renaissance back to indigenous forms, which is how we have a lot of really cool new pieces today. And then, again, the theme of religion, warfare, and practical use was covered in all of the regions in their artwork. And that is a big reference to the Metropolitan Museum.
So, classmates, do you have any questions to those presenters? Feel free to ask questions. Althea, or you would like to ask, or no?
We have a question.
Just, I guess the one art form we read about was tattooing. Was tattooing in all three as well, or was that more of just that was just a Polynesian thing? Or?
It wasn't really shown on this website because it's kind of hard to have an exhibit on tattooing. Yeah, these were mostly just physical art form. Good question.
Oh, very technical question. So all the references are from the museum's website, right? Including the history and wow.
It's a really, really good source.
Really
Yeah.
good website. Really gives like a lot of great information, and it's dated through like all different time periods from like the 1600s all the way up to the present. So.
Right. So thank you for your presentation. So next one